to Southern Health Podcast, Conversations with Perinatal Psychology, talking about maternal and paternal mental health, because your mental health matters for you and your children. My name is Dr Rachel Davies, and I'm a clinical psychologist with the Maternity Mental Health Service. I'm joined again today by Chris Gutteridge and Iain Page, and I'm just going to ask them to introduce themselves.
I'm Iain, and I'm married with 4 daughters aged 2, 5, 6 and 8.
I'm Chris Gutteridge, perinatal carers peer support worker and partners peer support worker for the charity APP. Also married with 2 children.
Thanks, Chris. So today we're talking again about partners' mental health in the perinatal period, because we're aware that this is an area that actually isn't very often spoken about. And today Iain kindly agreed to share his story and his experiences.
So if I kind of start from the beginning, I guess we found out that we were pregnant with our 4th daughter in it was January 2020. So that was just before kind of everything started with COVID in the March, I believe it was. All our previous children were born without any real issues. My second 2, or the middle 2 now, were both home births, water home births, all went fairly smoothly. And I've always been someone who's been quite involved in the pregnancy, go to all the midwife appointments, all the doctor's appointments. And for me, going to the scans and speaking to the doctors and the midwives was always a time that a way for me to bond with the baby. Because as a father at that point, nothing really changes for you. So, my wife's going through all these changes, she's feeling these changes, and it's very, very different experience for me. So that was my way of being more involved and bonding with my baby. Obviously, because of the pandemic, I wasn't able to go to any of the scans, any of the appointments. So that whole period, I didn't have that bonding that I would normally have, which definitely affected me. It was at a time where because I've sort of suffered with anxiety for a few years now. It was a time when my anxiety was very, very high anyway, because of COVID. So I really kind of struggled with that, and also felt very, very guilty that I wasn't able to support my wife in that period and share these experiences with her. So it was really, really challenging, especially when my wife was then diagnosed with gestational diabetes. And again, normally I would be at the appointments for that, so there to support her, which I was unable to do at this point. And we also, remember, we had sort of social distancing, and we weren't able to sort of lean on our support network. So it was kind of, my wife was just going through a lot of this on her own, and it was quite scary, especially as I think it was the 28-week check. She was diagnosed with preeclampsia. And again, when she was diagnosed with that, my kind of anxiety, she was quite calm about it, but my anxiety kind of hit the roof, and it was just very difficult for me to kind of support her, especially when she was going to the appointment. She wanted me there, but I couldn't be there. And I know, it wasn't my fault, but you still feel that element of guilt at not being able to be there. Then it was 7 weeks before the due date, and she was feeling unwell, and she'd be told if she felt unwell, call the hospital, which she did. Then they asked her just to go into the antenatal ward for monitoring. And the next morning, I got a phone call from the midwife saying, you need to come in. It was about 8 o'clock in the morning. I thought because there were discussions about if the preeclampsia progressed, then they might have to do a C-section. And so I thought they were going to discuss possibly doing that at some point over the next few days. But I wasn't given any details over the phone. When I got into the hospital, they asked me to wait outside for a bit. Then they let me into the room, because at this point, the sort of restrictions had eased. I got into the room, and it was just, it was like a scene out of a movie. It was full of doctors, nurses, all sorts. And they're quite big rooms, and it was just, there was barely any room to move. So straight away, that kind of it was like I walked into a brick wall. You know, straight away, something isn't right. My wife was on the bed. She had like, mask on. I could tell she was struggling to breathe. Then the doctors kind of came over, explained to me that the preeclampsia caused her lungs to fill with fluid, that she needed an emergency C-section. So straight away, this was, you hear the word emergency, and it's 7 weeks early. And again, at this point, you don't really know what questions to ask. So you kind of just stood there. At this point, the doctors were really good. They were kind of explaining everything. Were doing their best to explain everything to me. And they said they would try to get me to go, like, allow me in for the C-section as well. They said that she would need to kind of rest after the C-section, just to kind of help her body recover. But then at this point, all of a sudden, she just, things just started taking a turn for the worse. And doctors then just rushed her off to theatre. And all of a sudden, I was in this room with all this hustle and bustle, and then I was just in this room on my own. And that was kind of the way it was for the next hour. I was just sort of left in that room on my own, not having a clue what was going on. Honestly, that's one of the most terrifying moments of my life. I didn't know if the baby was going to be all right, if my wife was going to be all right. There was this kind of, I imagine it's from where they were putting needles into it, but there's just this pool of blood on the floor. And yeah, I was just kind of left in this room with it, not given any information for the next hour. Then eventually 2 doctors came in. They said to me that it had gone well. Baby was in the special care unit. My wife was in ICU, and that somebody would come and get me soon. I was kind of left again on my own. I don't even know how long it was for then, but it felt like forever before somebody kind of eventually came and got me. We went to see my daughter. Got taken straight away to see my daughter in special care unit, and she was kind of tucked away in the corner in a box. And yeah, sort of that. I sat down with her, and I can remember the experiences with my previous children. You're there. I was there with my wife. We're both kind of holding the baby, all this excitement, this happiness, all these emotions, excellent, like great emotions. And at this point, I was just sat there with my baby in a box on my own, I didn't have a clue what state my wife was in. This moment that's supposed to be one of the best moments of your life was just, it's hard to explain how it felt. I just sat there, and I didn't even realize, but there were like tears sort of streaming down my face. And this was the first time the nurse came over to me and just kind of, first time anyone asked me if I was okay and how I was doing. They were very good in there. At this point, there wasn't any information kind of forthcoming about my wife's situation. I had to keep asking the nurses to phone and chase that up for me. And not hearing anything, you just fear the worst. So, all these thoughts were kind of running through my head when I was sat there with my newborn baby. Like, am I going to be taking my newborn baby home just just me? Is that it? Am I ever going to see my wife again? Are my kids now not going to have a mother? All these kind of swirling emotions. Again, at this point, that is supposed to be such an amazing experience. I think it took about 3 or 4 hours till I kind of was allowed to then go see my wife. They said you can go see her in ICU, again, not knowing any information about her condition or how she was. And they eventually let me in. I remember the nurse in the special care unit told me not to be worried about the machinery, which kind of was a bit confusing at the time. I didn't really know what machinery she meant, but then she kind of explained to me and told me that my wife was on a ventilator, which is that's the first time I was told that she was on a ventilator, which was effectively breathing for her. So I went into the room, and again, this was one of the worst experiences of my life. Kind of just going in there, she's just lying there with this machine breathing for her. And that's when the kind of doctors explained to me that, again, there wasn't really a lot of information forthcoming, and I was only allowed in there for about 10 minutes because of COVID restrictions. They didn't really know how long she would be on it for. They were going to, keep trying to take her off it, see how her body reacted, but that was kind of all the information I was given, really. And then I was sent back to the special care baby unit, and that was it for the rest of the day, really. I sat with her until about, I think, midnight, 1 o'clock. I was sat there with her. It was all a bit of a blur, to be honest. Till eventually the nurse kind of persuaded me to go home and get some sleep, which I thought in the end was probably the best thing to do. And I needed to go see my other children. I needed to be there in the morning to see them so that they weren't worried as well. The next morning, I went back into the hospital quite early, and she was taken off the ventilator. And the next 10 days, she was sent to the cardiac care unit because she suffered, as well as her lungs filling with fluid, she suffered from heart failure. So they took her in. She was in there for the next 10 days to be monitored. And in those 10 days, again, because of the restrictions, she was only allowed to see the baby for very, very short periods, like that 20 minutes a day if she was lucky, because she wasn't allowed to leave. They didn't want to move the baby across the hospital because of COVID. And as well as that, I mean, the staff in the special care unit were short staffed, so they didn't have the staff to do that. So that was really, really difficult for my wife. Like, obviously she was unwell, she was scared, and she just had a baby that she wasn't allowed to see. And I was sat with her as much as I could do, and there was nothing I could do. So she was very, very distressed, and I'm doing my best to make her feel better, but I can't. And it feels like at that point it's my job. At that point it's my job to look after everyone, to look after my kids, to look after our new baby, and to look after her. And with her, I just couldn't do it. There's nothing I could do, and I felt awful. I felt so guilty and so helpless that I couldn't help her and I couldn't support her. And also, I felt like not being able to see the baby was impacting her health. Because whenever she did manage to see the baby, it felt like her kind of, her obs and her stats always got better. And then the baby was taken away, and then they got worried about her again. But yeah, throughout this period as well, there was midwives came in, nurses came in, and all the focus was on my wife, and rightly so. But I was sort of more like the furniture. There was no one kind of asked how I was until it was the obs and gynae consultant came in, and she was the first person, apart from the nurse in the SCBU, that asked me how I was and encouraged me to look after myself. Other than that, nobody else kind of talked to me about anything. This period, I kind of, I didn't even really think there was anything wrong with me. I didn't feel like there should be anything wrong with me. I wasn't the one that had been through all of this. It was my wife. I should be fine. I should be the one looking after everyone. And I was running on adrenaline still. I kind of wake up. Luckily, we were living with my wife's parents at that time, so I could leave the kids with them. I'd wake up, sort the kids out, go to the hospital for the rest of the day, pop home to see the kids at bedtime, go back to the hospital, and I was just running on adrenaline. It was like non-stop. So I didn't really think about myself. I didn't really care for myself in that period as well. It was all kind of, I need to look after my family as best that I could. Eventually, after 10 days, when we got home, I still hadn't really acknowledged that I was struggling, but this was sort of the point where my wife picked up on it, or started to pick up on it. I had become quite disconnected with our new baby, even though in the hospital I was with her all the time. I was holding her all the time. It was fine in the hospital, but when we got home, I think I wasn't really processing what had happened, but that's when everything kind of started to really kind of come to the surface. Yeah, so I was very disconnected with the baby. I didn't connect with her, or I hadn't connected with her, and I think in part that was because I never had that bond that I did with my previous children throughout the pregnancy. I didn't really want to hold her for long periods of time. I was always passing her back to my wife. I really couldn't tolerate her crying. Didn't really want to be around her all that much. I mean, I knew how much I loved her, so I couldn't really understand why I didn't want to be with her. I didn't want to look after her. And then you also have those feelings of guilt again. I felt like a terrible father. I felt like a terrible husband. Like my wife was still unwell. She'd gone through so much, and I went from being like kind of on it when she was in hospital to kind of the other end of the scale, where I just wasn't really much use at all. I wasn't very pleasant to be around. And again, this was like, I felt like there shouldn't be anything wrong with me. I should be fine. I didn't go through anything, so I shouldn't be feeling like this. And that was always in my head. And maybe that's kind of why I pushed any feelings that I had down. I buried everything, but I was very kind of irritable. I was always sad, kind of gloomy. I didn't take any enjoyment in things, especially like with my family. But again, through this period, we had midwife visits, and again, because of COVID, the midwife would kind of come in and they go into a room with my wife and then leave. So there was no interaction with me. Kind of no one asked how I was doing and how I was feeling, and and I don't know. I think maybe if I sat down with somebody and they asked the right questions, it might have kind of made me realize what was going on a lot earlier. I was I'm in quite a lucky position where my wife's a psychologist, so she could see what was going on and she knew how to approach it. She knew the right kind of questions to ask, and she knew how to kind of make me realize what was going on with me. It didn't happen overnight, but she kind of she supported me. Again, and at this, she shouldn't have been supporting me at that point, or that's how I felt anyway. I should be supporting her. But eventually I kind of succumbed and understood that there was something not right. This was about 2 months after we got back home from the hospital. And that's when I contacted the NHS self-referral therapy, which is a service that I had used before. So again, I think having been in that position before where I've kind of understood that I'm suffering from anxiety and something was wrong, and then contacting a service and going through that was kind of beneficial at this point. And that kind of mixed with my wife being a psychologist really helped me. And I attended a father's wellbeing group. So we kind of all discussed, it was all very different experiences, but a lot of similarities as well, which I found I was a bit hesitant about doing at first, talking in front of, it's hard, I think as a man, you kind of always hard enough for you to talk about your feelings anyway. So to kind of sit down in a group with a bunch of strangers and do it felt very, very, I was very hesitant to do it, but actually after the first session, it felt brilliant because you got all these other people, again, like I said, with different experiences, but a lot of similarities as well. And I found that really kind of comforting in a way. And after we had a few more sessions, and they really, really helped. So I'd be very, I wouldn't be reluctant to go to a group session again, and it was excellent. But yeah, that's kind of our experience. So a lot of that, there's a lot of feeling on the outside, I think, and not feeling like there should be anything wrong with me. Or I say wrong, I say, I shouldn't be feeling the way that I was feeling because I didn't go through anything, but actually I did go through something. It was different, but it was still relevant and still important.
So if you look back now, so from a kind of perspective, can you see that theme or those things that would have affected you, that would have, can you pick out those things that did have an impact on you?
Do you mean like with what happened?
Yeah, with what happened, to actually say, you know what, there is a reason why I struggled. It does make sense. I can understand.
Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. Definitely. Looking back at it in hindsight and looking at the whole picture, there's a lot of things, traumatic events that they will have affected me, and rightly so. Yeah.
I think you were talking about almost from the start, that sense with COVID of actually that isolation, almost, because you couldn't, for the sort of right reasons at the time, the safety reasons that hospitals have put in, that were doing what they thought was best at the time in terms of isolation to prevent from COVID spread. You were excluded from scans and things that would help you to sort of almost realise this pregnancy was happening, that this baby was coming, that you did have a child there.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, again, because of the restrictions that were in place, which were rightly in place, there wasn't any of that. And then all of a sudden, it's just this big traumatic experience, and then there's a baby. And so you're trying to be a father whilst also unknowingly dealing with trauma. Yeah, and I think, the other responsibilities you have sort of sit on top of that, those feelings and those emotions, and they just get pushed down, which makes them a lot worse.
Because I think I was really struck where you were talking about the sitting with your baby when she was in this kind of box on the special care kind of baby unit, and almost that sense of shock, because of how fast things had happened as well, with that 12 hours before. You would not have expected yourself to have been in that position, because yes, your wife had gone into hospital, but it wasn't that you had any warning that suddenly this baby would be here, because it was 7 weeks to go. You still had,
there's no expectation of having a baby the next day. No. So she went in for some monitoring, expected her to really maybe come out the day after, or maybe the day after that, with maybe a bit more of a plan in place about what was going to happen, but it certainly didn't expect there to suddenly be a newborn baby.
No. And then not to be in that way, because you weren't even there at the birth, were you, to be able to see her?
No,
kind of
and again, she's the first one I wasn't there for. So my other three daughters, I was there all the way through. So kind of losing that experience as well.
Yeah, so that opportunity to process that this child is really mine is kind of been removed throughout, hasn't it? Through the pregnancy and not being involved in the appointments, then not being there at the birth, and then you, your wife, and the baby not all being together. Yeah,
exactly. And the first time I met her, she was in a plastic box.
And then you're trying to hold it together between seeing your wife, seeing your baby, seeing your 3 children at home, and kind of on autopilot.
Yeah, it was autopilot for that 10 days, the period she was in hospital. It was all autopilot, from one responsibility to the next. I knew what I needed to do, and I did it. And none of it was about me. It was all about looking after, taking care of everybody else. And so there was no sort of processing of what had happened at all. And like you say, there was the shock, but there was also joy. Like when I first saw her, that was, it's you had that happiness, and then that sadness, and then being terrified as well. It was all this mixture all in one, and it's just so difficult to process that
kind of whole mix of emotions that are in there. Makes sense, and to really sit down and be able to go through what's gone on, and there's just not that opportunity, is there?
No, there isn't.
You were talking about that sense of just throughout the pregnancy, throughout the birth, throughout everything that happened afterwards, of that helplessness as well, of not being able to help to make things better in the way that you wanted to.
Yeah, because that's what we've always supported each other, and I couldn't support her in what was a really difficult time for her. The finding out she had gestational diabetes, then finding out that she had preeclampsia. I couldn't be there. Like, she wanted me at the appointments, and I couldn't be there for her. And it's difficult. It is a feeling of helplessness. Like, there's nothing I could do to make that better for her, and that's really, really hard.
That sense, of helplessness, of not having that control, can often have such a significant impact on mental health.
Yeah, exactly. And it was the same in the hospital when she wasn't allowed to really see the baby. Like, all she wanted was her daughter, and there's nothing I could do to make that happen. She'd be crying as soon as they took her away, because she didn't know if she'd be able to see her again that day, or, even if she'd be able to see her the next day. There were times where they said they'd bring her down, but obviously then something's come up and they haven't been able to, so she'd be sat there waiting. And sometimes, she'd be expecting her at say 1, and she wouldn't actually come down till about 8. And again, I can go see her, because at that point parents were allowed in for 24 hours a day. And then there was that guilt that I could sit there with her and I could see her, but my wife couldn't. And it's just, there's nothing, again, helplessness, guilt, all these things
that you're feeling.
Yeah. When all you want to do is make everyone feel better.
That theme of helplessness I can relate to from my own story as well.
Yeah, it's awful. And you just keep thinking, you're trying to think of ways that you can fix things, and you can't. It doesn't stop you trying, but
no. And sometimes it can be really hard to accept that sense of, you can do things by being there for them, by visiting them, by supporting them, even if you can't change the situation. But that can be really hard sometimes to sit with as well. Because obviously, when you love someone, when you care, you want to help, you want to make things better, you want to change things.
Yeah, exactly. And you're just sitting there not being able to, and she's sort of upset and crying, and try to comfort her, but that's all you can do is really give her a cuddle and try to kind of tell her it's going to be okay. But at that point, it's not okay. It's hard for her to see that. And again, you're sitting there feeling bad, but you're not the one going through it. So you stop feeling that way and just kind of try and fix everything.
Yeah.
But then it's a vicious circle.
Yeah. But actually you are the one going through it, because you're going through it with them, and it is tough. And it's how you can then also, I suppose, accept that in yourself, that I am going to be, it's understandable I'm struggling, I'm understandable I'm finding this hard.
And I think it's a lot easier to approach it when it's there's a physical representation of what's going on. Like, my wife went through everything physically. She was in hospital. Yeah. She had all these wires connected to her. All the doctors were coming, speaking to her about, how she was doing, and there's no physical element of it to me. It's all, it's invisible. So that's when I think it's a lot harder to acknowledge, when there's nothing there to really kind of see. There's nothing like, you could see that she was unwell. You could see what she had been through. So it's a lot easier to acknowledge that. Whereas
what we know is that witnessing that, being the bystander, being the person alongside, especially when you're feeling helpless, can have such a significant impact on your health.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And well-being.
Yes. And it's, as soon as you start to kind of acknowledge that and appreciate that, it's a big help on kind of them moving forward and getting help and dealing with it and overcoming it. But you do need to understand that it is okay for you to feel the way that you're feeling, because you have been through something incredibly difficult. Yeah, and like you said, it all started with the not being able to go to the scans, that disconnect, and then all of a sudden being thrown into this situation, and you might lose your wife, you might be raising your children on their own. She might never meet your daughter, and these are all very relevant feelings and important feelings, and they will have an impact on you. And it's only right that you feel the way and accept that you feel the way that you're feeling and how it affects you. There's a lot easier to kind of acknowledge that following when you can look back on it and you've had some help.
You mentioned when you were talking, Iain, about being asked about how you are, or not particularly being asked about how you were at key points. And I was just wondering, as you were talking about it, is there a key time where you wish you'd been asked about how you are? Because there's not a lot of time for it. Like you say, you're running on adrenaline, you just want to help, you're just there for your wife and your baby. And actually being asked those questions, you're not going to engage with them properly. Right. But was there a time where, looking back now, you think, if somebody had asked me how I was then, or asked me something, it would have helped me sooner?
Yeah, I think really the key time for me would have been the sort of home visits, the follow-up midwife visits. I think if somebody had sort of sat down with me in a room on my own, ask me the right questions, then it all would have kind of poured to the surface. I think just, and I don't know what kind of questions, but I guess just sort of like, generally, how are you? How are you feeling? I guess, how's your connection with the baby? How are you dealing with, sort of sort of waking up in the night, crying, how, do you want to feel like you want to spend time with, all those sort of questions, like, do you want to spend time with the baby? And not phrased like that, obviously, but I think, the right questions at that point would have helped me a lot sooner.
So almost once the kind of main trauma challenges are over, that I know that the baby, so once you're out of hospital, once you're no longer on that adrenaline drive of I've got to be in 3 different places at once, sort of things are slowing down, things are calming down on the surface, that actually that's that point where that it'd be helpful to think about how the parents and the dads are doing.
I think that, like I said, the obs and gynae consultant, she asked me how I was. She told me I needed to take care of myself. And at that point, I'm like, you know what, I'm fine. Let's just focus on my wife, focus on the baby. I'm all right. I'm getting through it. Again, it's like that. Nothing's happened to me. I'm all right. But following that, when the adrenaline has died down, if I had been asked certain questions, I think I probably would have broken down at that point, and then it all would have just flooded out. And again, it scares me, the thought of if my wife wasn't a psychologist and hadn't picked up on these things, how long it would have taken.
And do you think that had you known kind of what you know now about actually, it makes sense that you were struggling, that it makes sense that it was tough for you, that it was traumatic for you, do you think that would have helped you feel able to maybe talk more or open up more as well?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of it's about sort of early, I think kind of early knowledge, I guess. I feel that I think through the whole process of pregnancy and that is rightly so, the focus is always on my wife. I don't know if there should be some early kind of, I think maybe there should be some of a focus on the father as well. I think just saying, look, these are things, that you could struggle with potentially. Like, even in just like a leaflet or something, like if you're experiencing trauma, these could be potential signs of that. This is who you could contact. I think a lot of people, you go into parenthood with all this, like, this is what I've got to look forward to, which is, and you should. But there are things like this that can happen. And I think it's important for fathers to know that, it's okay for them to struggle. And this is what they could be feeling. These are the kind of symptoms they could have. And this is who they could contact. And I think that could, I think if, say my wife wasn't a psychologist, if I had that, prior and had that knowledge, when you're sitting there not wanting to hold your baby, you might think, right, I remember seeing this or somebody talking to me about this. And there might not be something quite right here. So I think that something like that could help massively. Again, it's just about having a conversation with someone, like, very early on. And
I guess kind of from attending that group and things, that was that validation as well of actually, this is really understandable. Many fathers go through it. And reduces that sense of isolation of, gosh, there must be something really wrong with me if I'm not coping with this right now.
Yeah, it really does. It made me feel a lot better knowing that, actually this is okay. And I'm not the only one going through something like this. And it helps you kind of feel like there is a light at the end of the tunnel as well. When you hear about people that have been through it and have got through it. It's it kind of gets rid of a lot of that kind of fear.
So like you were talking about, a leaflet or something, and that group, it's just that validation, isn't it? That actually partners, fathers do go through, those people that witness it do go through a tough time as well. it will impact your mental health. That's really understandable, and it's okay.
Yes.
To ask for that help, to reach
exactly
out.
that. Yeah, that validation. Yeah, it's understanding that, because it's very hard to feel that way when you're on your own. It definitely helps to kind of talk about it.
Thank you for sharing your story. It's been so helpful. Is there anything else you feel be important to mention?
Awareness, I think. It's just you don't really, again, like we were just saying, you don't see much about fathers' mental health out there. And I think if people did, then you might kind of encourage them to get help when they need it.
So again, that awareness, that validation, that it's okay.
It's okay to ask for help when you need help and you rightly need help.
And like you say about that awareness, Ian, I sort of alluded to it in my own story, didn't I? And that it's not the social view of what it's going to be like to have a baby isn't always true, and it's not helpful to have that. It's all going to be amazing. It's all going to go perfectly. You're so lucky. Congratulations. It's not always that easy, and you don't expect it. You're not prepared for it,
right?
Because people don't talk about the hard parts.
That's right. Yeah, and people don't know what kind of help is out there for them, and there is help out there.
Yeah, there is help out there, absolutely. And actually, if we talked about it more openly, you'd know about the help, whether you need it or not, going into a birth.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you both again. Thank you, Iain, for sharing your story. If you have been affected at all by what we've been talking about today, you can access support through your GP or the health visitor, or call 111, who have mental health experts on hand. You can also go to the Southern Health website and click the Help in a Crisis link, which has a list of local support contacts. Thank you for listening to Conversations with Perinatal Psychology, talking about maternal and paternal mental health, because your mental health matters for you and your